Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, "My grandmother was a bad person and a worse driver. I made sure she lost her license. Grandma was a monster, let's leave it at that. She was cruel, and sometimes violent, to our entire family and even her friends. Grandma also happened to be the world's worst driver. She would hit parked cars and drive off without leaving a note, litter out the window, very illegal here in California, and generally drive like a psycho. Grandma refused to see a doctor. She had a mortal fear of being institutionalized, for good reason. So when she had some physical problems, she wouldn't get them treated. She was driving around with one hand and couldn't really turn her head to look around either. Mum set up grocery delivery, etc., but Grandma wouldn't give up driving voluntarily. Well, California has a law on the books that allows anyone to report a dangerous driver to the DMV and request a re-examination. It exists because so many people like me have relatives who are no longer physically and/or mentally fit to drive, and we may not be able to make them stop on their own. I filled out the form and boy, did I have a lot of dirt on Grandma's driving habits. I had to use extra pages. Sure enough, Grandma got a letter from the DMV. They insisted she take the driver's test again, and required she receive a medical examination first. I knew damn well Grandma wouldn't see a doctor. And she didn't. Since she refused to comply with the DMV within the required time frame, they suspended her license. Edited to add, Grandma planned to ignore the suspension, so Dad secretly disabled her car. Grandma eventually had to go to a care facility, and I would have to take Mum to visit her. I would stand back, only speaking to Grandma when absolutely necessary, and sharing nothing personal. She craved attention, among other things. She was a narcissist, so I ignored her as much as possible. By the way, I was Grandma's favorite grandchild. I never did tell her that I was the reason she had her license suspended. The next one is titled, "Stupid Car Driver or Just Blind." This happened too many years ago. We went to a local supermarket. There was a huge car park and an area set aside for motorbikes. This area was painted blue and had a huge sign stating clearly that this was for motorbikes only. This area was adjacent to the ATMs. A car is parked in the motorbike bay. The driver had to have noticed as their front bumper was touching the sign. On the passenger side, a motorbike was parked close to the door. I asked the people at the ATMs if the car was theirs. Everyone denied it. I made a note of the registration number and asked security if they could ask the driver to move their car. Revenge Part 1. Parked as close as I could without touching the rear of the car, went in and did a bit of shopping. When I came back to my car, the driver was waiting and was red in the face with anger. As I was putting my items in the top box, he started yelling at me, telling me to hurry up and how petty I was being. I calmly replied, "Where's your motorbike?" He pointed at his car. I said, "No." I asked, "Where is your motorbike?" I pointed at the sign. As this is going on, another motorbike arrives. He sees the car driver angry attitude towards me. He parked his motorbike next to, but not touching the driver's door. He then starts chatting with me. The car driver is getting increasingly angry with us. The other motorcyclist asked the car driver, "Do you have a license? I'm guessing you're not blind. Use your ducking eyes." The car driver, looking perplexed, said, What has that got to do with you?" The motorcyclist said, "Either you're ignorant or blind. You missed this ducking sign." Points at the sign. "Obviously you don't need this. Smash driver's side wing mirror, or this." Smashes the passenger side. He then said to me, "I don't about you, but this has made me thirsty. Wanna drink?" I would have loved to have stayed, but I couldn't. I had an appointment to get to. A couple of hours later I rode past there. The car was still there, still boxed in on both sides with another bike at the rear. A beautiful sight. Edit, this took part in an Asda car park. Asda is part of Walmart. The next one is titled, "Revenge on the Sales Manager," for the children. When I was around 20, I worked at a large music store chain that you've probably heard of. I worked in the guitar sales department and honestly liked the job, despite their tepid flavor of the commission-based pay model. Only a few employees would ever really make enough commission to actually have those sales counted toward their pay. It was a threshold you had to meet, and it was set quite high. So for most of us, we were just making whatever the hourly rate was as a baseline. But this didn't really bother me by itself. I chose to work there. Like most businesses, the commission is directly related to the profit margin. We call this margin the JIP, higher is better. Meet the sales manager, perpetually angry, middle-aged, pubes for hair guy with a shitty attitude and a shitty car. He would encourage us to sell the gear with the highest JIP, as this directly translates into store profit. That makes sense, but it was often at the expense of the customer's actual needs, and our reviews were suffering. I was being asked to push a specific guitar manufacturer that starts with M because we get them for cheap but sell them for almost as much as decent solid top acoustic guitars. Plus, he was just a dick to us most of the time. Price matching is a sore subject. Online stores were starting to mature into a real threat to brick-and-mortar businesses at the time, and the deals were out there, and we had a price matching policy. We have a weekly employee meeting, and the sales manager pointed out a popular price match that was going around. It was a really decent Yamaha acoustic that we carried, and it came with a shitload of accessories for less than our store's internal cost of just the guitar. He wanted us to essentially deny this price match by applying some excuse he thought of, which was supposed to disqualify its validity but was mostly hot air. It was my last month there, and I knew I wasn't going to meet that commission threshold. A mother comes in with her middle school aged son. He's been saving up his allowance and wants to buy a guitar. Per my training, we point him to the M brand guitars, which are the cheapest. But they're plywood pieces of crap, and I just couldn't sell him that rubbish. The kid saved up his money. Let's do this properly and give him a great experience. So I decided to tell the mother about that deal and our price matching policy, thanks to Pubes for Hair for pointing it out to me. I made sure I was the one at the register. This ended up with the son being ecstatic. He had a quality guitar and everything else he needed with a few dollars left over. The mother was eager to make this concession worth my risk and asked to speak to my manager to tell him how excellent her experience was with me. I was feeling pretty good about it. I felt like I did the right thing. Even if it was a loss, they will be here when he needs new strings or whatever else. You just built a relationship. I heard all about how excellent I was the next day from the sales manager. He decided to be a twat about it and ream me for accepting that price match. We lost nearly $20, and it was the end of the world to him. It was like I ruined his entire week. Out of spite, I offered this same arrangement to 3 or 4 more people who came in the similar situations. The kid wants a first guitar, but the money isn't there for anything fancy. I knew I was quitting soon, and I wanted to put a good guitar in these kids' hands. So here's a price match. Enjoy an excellent guitar that will last you many years, and tell the manager duck you on the way out. No regrets, and there was no drama when I quit. The next one is titled, Teacher Hits Student and Gets Blacklisted. So this story comes from my father. The cast, my father, we'll call him John, to protect identities. The substitute teacher, who we'll call Street for short. The story, my father grew up in the lovely state of New Jersey and attended high school in the late 1970s. He was a well-behaved kid, as my grandfather and principal were friends. My grandparents knew everyone. One day my dad's English teacher, for reasons unknown, had to stop teaching for the foreseeable future and was replaced with the substitute teacher. This teacher was apparently from the Deep South and evidently was barely qualified to even teach English. Now English was my dad's first class of the day, so every day he would come into school with a coffee from the local donut chain to get him going in the morning. This is where the drama began. The first day Street is teaching, they see my dad with his coffee and go, "John, you can't have that in my class." My dad, Yes, I can. There were no rules against drinks in classes, so that was the end, only it wasn't. The next day rolls around, another coffee in class. St. John, you can't drink that in my class. My dad, yes, I can. There's no rules against it and I've been doing it all year. Again, end of argument. Third day rolls around, and as my dad sits down at his desk, piping hot cup of joe in hand, Street storms over, takes the coffee and throws it in the garbage. Needless to say, this stopped the morning coffee for the time. A few weeks go by without issue. The incident, remember when I said that Street was from the deep south and barely qualified to teach English? Well, a few weeks after the coffee debacle, Street makes a simple, and I mean beginner-level, grammatical error on the chalkboard. Now my grandmother was a court reporter and had perfect grammar. She actually founded a court reporting school in NJ, and raised my dad and uncle with the same, so my dad pipes up, and corrects Street on their error. Saint just scoffs and continues the lesson. The next day comes around and Saint makes another grammatical error, to which my dad, once again, speaks up to correct them. Once again Street ignores him and continues on. Third day comes and Saint makes, you guessed it, another screw up, and of course, my dad corrects them. This time Street stops the lesson and faces the class and, John, come here. My dad complies, thinking he's about to be reprimanded. The second he gets there in front of the class, Street reels back and slaps my dad across the face. Now, my dad is a stocky fellow, he's about 5 feet 8 inches and, even back then, was built like a gorilla. I've seen pictures, so he took the slap like a champion. With Saint standing there with a smug sense of authority, my dad rubs his cheek, looks toward his fellow students, who are all staring at them in shock, and simply says, I am defending my rights as a student, and whirls around and delivers a single punch worthy of Captain Falcon. Saint falls to the ground with a broken jaw, writhing in pain. My dad collects himself and tells his fellow students that he'll be heading to the principal's office, and promptly does so, leaving Street on the floor to contemplate their life choices. On his way to the office, my dad stops at the school phone and calls my grandfather and tells him to come to the school. Once my dad, grandfather and principal are all gather, he tells them both what happened. The two of them are furious. And the principal immediately calls Street to the office. The revenge. So again, remember how Street was from the south? And how my dad went to school in New Jersey. Fun little thing about the good old Garden State, corporal punishment, the physical disciplining of students by their teachers, has been illegal in New Jersey since 1867. When Street slapped my dad, they broke state law. Needless to say, Street was immediately sacked and permanently banned from teaching in New Jersey. Luckily the story has a happy ending. Remember how my grandfather and the principal were friends? Well, the principal knew my dad on a somewhat personal level and knew they would never act as they did without just cause, so my dad got off with a slap on the wrist. And who did the school bring in to teach English for the rest of the year? Why, none other than my grandmother, of course. The next one is titled, Customer Flips Out Over the Word Courtesy, Loses Out on Fee Waiver. This technically wasn't my petty revenge, but that of a coworker of mine that I was witness to. I worked in a call center for a credit card company. At the time there was a $10 fee for processing a payment over the phone. I'm not here to justify it, that's just what it was, and it was perfectly legal. It was one of those things that a CSR could choose to waive, but were definitely not required to, and in fact would have to justify their reasoning for waiving it. Waive too many and you'll get a lesser raise, worse shift choices, etc., so not a lot of people waived them. Anyway, I was sitting with a girl, listening to her call as part of my job at the time, and she received a call that went like this, verbatim. I want to make a payment over the phone, the customer said gruffly. That's no problem, replied the rep. It does have to be with a check and there is a $10 processing fee for that. A fee? I didn't know there was a fee. Well, I can waive it for you as a courtesy, since this is your first time paying by phone. Just remember you can always pay online or in the store. A courtesy, he shrieked, cutting her off. It isn't a courtesy. You can't consider it a courtesy if there is no other way to pay the dang bill. I'm going to waive it for you, sir, she pleaded, trying to talk him down from his unhinged fury. It's no problem, but there are other payment methods, as I was saying you can. This isn't right, he continued to berate her. How dare you say it's a courtesy? I want to talk to your supervisor right now. At that point she was required to transfer to a supervisor, getting someone I knew quite well and who had little patience for jerk customers. I didn't hear that call myself, but I talked to the supervisor after. Upon getting the call, the customer screamed at her, the supervisor, for the word courtesy being used and demanded an apology and to pay his bill. She apologized, she was required to, we all were, regardless of fault or logic when talking to a customer, and offered to take his payment. However, because he was being an a-hole, she refused to waive the $10 fee, which was her prerogative and totally allowed. The prior rep had made a judgment call to offer to waive the fee. That was that individual's decision, and since he didn't allow her to process the payment, thus he didn't accept her offer. The next person was not bound by that, and the way our phones were set up, it was impossible to transfer it back to the original CSR. It is definitely a fine line she towed, but it was still allowed. He ultimately made the payment with the fee, and that was that. Let that be a lesson. Don't be a dick and set your ego aside. The next one is titled, When a Neighbor Who Complains About Noise Wants Help from Something Noisy. I had a neighbor that complained about noise all the time. We had never had a complaint from neighbors on that property before, or on the other side. The first few times we tried to be nice, but when she started swearing at my wife for vacuuming at 2 p.m. on a Saturday, we realized there was nothing we could do to make them happy and just ignored them. The next winter we got hit by a major snowstorm that dumped a massive amount of wet snow, froze it into solid ice, then another storm 2 days later covered it with more heavy snow. It was an absolute witch to shovel. A relative came over to help us dig out, and brought a backhoe. Our driveway was done in 3 minutes. The neighbor had been shoveling for 2 hours and made almost no headway, so they went to my relative to ask him to help them out. He said, "Are you the neighbor that complains about noise? I wouldn't want to make any loud noises in your driveway. Better for you to do it by hand," and then drove off. It was glorious. The next one is titled, Flush Diapers Down the Toilet? Better watch out. So my teacher lives in a 3-story house, not including the basement, and up the street is some condos. One of the condos is a family with children. One day my teacher's wife goes into their basement to do laundry. She smelled dirty diapers. I guess dirty diapers have a distinct smell. She recognized this isn't normal and called my teacher, explaining that it smells like dirty diapers. Their kids are all grown up, so obviously it wasn't coming from them. My teacher thought about it and speculated someone up the street was flushing dirty diapers down their toilet. He said to his wife, "Don't flush the toilet, don't use the washer, don't use the sink." He proceeds to call the person that put in the sewer system of his house. They're friends, so he was willing to help him out. What the guy told him to do was plug every drain in his house with some sort of drain plug they sell at home improvement stores for this kind of reason. He even had to take his toilets off and plug the drain on them all except for his 3rd floor. Wait for it. Once he did that according to his friend's instructions, go to the 3rd floor and flush every toilet. He said when he did this it was so clogged up in the pipes, water started coming from the drain of his bathroom and he had to plug it up. Nothing was happening until he just heard this giant whoosh noise in his pipes. A couple of minutes later fire trucks were showing up to the condos up the street and he knew it worked. The reason why this happened was since his idiot neighbors were flushing diapers down the toilet. The way the sewer system works is that it goes downstream of elevation. So coming from the condos down the street, then it comes off at an intersection and goes to his house. The diapers were caught at that intersection and actually going into his house, just the pipes luckily, unless they didn't take the right action. So by plugging all of the drains except the 3rd floor, the liquid would need more pressure to travel up to the 3rd floor, or by flushing all of the toilets and introducing a lot of pressure into the system because it's at a higher elevation on the 3rd floor. It shot all of the clogged up sewage back upstream, even though it's going upstream. Remember, pressure, all of his drains were plugged including the sewage system going down the street, so there's only one way to go, to the neighbor's house and into their house. That's why you don't flush diapers down the toilet, they expand. Actually, don't flush anything other than what should go down there. Your house could just be covered in poo next time because your neighbor knows what she's doing. The next one is titled, Who Should Have Turned Out to My Worst Neighbor Ended Up Being My Best. I moved next door to a guy called Dave. He lived alone with his 4 rescue dogs. Dave was very welcoming. He knocked to my house the day we moved in and gave me a bottle of wine as a gift and introduced himself. I liked Dave from that moment. Dave had disabilities, so had a disabled car spec outside of his house. The parking in that street was a nightmare and had a huge impact on our decision to move. I will get to why this is important soon. There was an old couple called Mr. and Mrs. Love. How cute? Lovely old dears. They stopped to say hi one day whilst I was painting my front wall. Mrs. Love told me to be careful of Dave. Apparently, he was an awful man who complains and fights with all the neighbors. He would call the police for no good reason and he was cruel to his dogs. Okay, wow. The woman across the street told me he was a pedophile who took videos from his bedroom of kids playing. Another told me he called child protection on them for abusing their kids. He shot one neighbor's cat with a pellet gun because it was in his garden, one of them said. So, Dave was not a popular chap. I'm not one for gossip, but it's hard not to be wary when all your neighbors are telling you that the Antichrist is living next door. When my dog had puppies, Dave gave me his number and told me to call him anytime, day or night, if I needed help. He was slightly deaf and didn't always hear the doorbell. Dave let me use the shared entry that was also his to store some things that I had no space for. Dave fed my cat when I went away. Dave never complained when my teenage son and his friends were rowdy. Dave told me he was leaving his home to the Dogs Trust upon his death, in return for them to take his dogs and rehome them. Dave looked after my dogs when I was going through something and wasn't home a lot. He never pried. He just supported me by being there. Dave cried when I gave him a Christmas card. He never had one before from a neighbor. Dave helped me move to my new house, which wasn't far away, by bringing bits around that I forgot when the movers came. The parking spot was the reason that the neighbors started a witch hunt for Dave. They said he scammed the council and wasn't really ill. Dave got something that they wanted. They didn't like it. Dave had cancer, by the way. Nobody cared to ask. It was easier to start a hate campaign. It took one neighbor to tell an exaggerated story and begin the snowball effect that had Dave labeled as a pariah. I still see Dave. The other neighbors, I walk past them if I see them around. All of them are the worst neighbors I ever had. I hope the couple who moved into my house appreciates how lucky they are to have Dave next door. The last one is titled, "My aunt's neighbor tried to run over her dog." My aunt, who was a single mother at the time and ran a daycare service in her house, lived next to a psychopath. After a bad ice storm one day, my aunt had a bunch of tree limbs fall into her backyard. Her neighbor's husband came over and cleaned it up for her. Yeah, no, just being a good neighbor. And in turn, my aunt thanked him with a case of beer. Yeah, no, just being a good neighbor. Well, his wife took that as flirting, and so began a one-sided feud against my aunt. It was a while ago, so I don't remember everything. What I remember though was horrifying. She tried to run over my aunt's dog once. Another time she called Child Protective Services and told them my aunt was a prostitute and working at her house during the daycare hours. Probably the worst one though was when my aunt found a bit of her house and grass near the house burnt. She's old high school friends with the fire inspector, so he came and confirmed a fire was started using a propellant. My aunt took her to court over these things, but I don't remember what came of it. I'm pretty sure she at least got a restraining order. Thanks for listening.